Everyone. I hope you can hear me. Um, Unless I hear otherwise, I assume you can hear me. Hi from Austin. I saw a hand wave, so that's a good sign. Uh, Hi from Austin. Um, I'm David Stuart, and I'm going to be presenting this evening on a kind of special, interesting topic in Maya studies. But before we get into the particulars of Palenque and Temple 18, I wanted to mention kind of what this particular talk is about in a larger sense, which is it's being sponsored through Boundary End Archaeology Research Center, which is in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina, a beautiful place. And it's a research center and retreat that at a library that my father started a number of years ago. And many of you are probably familiar with what Boundary End is. We have a website that describes our mission. We conceived of this particular talk and workshop that goes along with it as a fundraiser and a way of supporting the center. And so I'm really thankful that you all have signed up to hear this. I wanted to thank a few people who were instrumental in getting this going. Joe Hamilton and Charles Wortman twisted my arm not very strongly to use Temple 18 at Palenque as a topic. It's something that I hadn't really thought about presenting about before, and then they were like convincing me, hey, this would be a great workshop on Maya hieroglyphs, a great puzzle. And absolutely right. I mean, it's kind of a ready-made puzzle for students and people who are interested in Maya hieroglyphs to start tackling. And so we thought this would be a great way to develop a workshop in support of Boundary End. So what I'm going to be doing today is not a lecture that, puts it all together or reads the inscription from Temple 18. Some of you may not have even heard what this really is or what Temple 18 is. We're going to talk a lot about that in some of the context. This introductory lecture presentation is really about giving this context and background, right? So talking about Palenque, talking about the historical setting of this temple that very few people have ever seen or visited at Palenque. Even people who've been there many times haven't seen this particular structure. The history of research there, the archaeology that was done, the documentation that was done, the physicality of the building is really important for understanding the hieroglyphs and the inscription, and needless to say, the way it was presented originally. So this is the beginning of a much deeper analysis, a much deeper dive into the particulars of the inscription and of the hieroglyphs. So I'm not going to really go into the nuts and bolts of readings of signs and that kind of thing. This is a broader treatment about the temple and about its history and how we approach it, right? In putting this together, I've also learned a lot of things I didn't know about Temple 18, which I'll share with you, and some new, I think, reconstructions, very tentative ones of maybe what the program of sculpture looked like inside of the temple. By the way, I also want to thank the executive director of Boundary End, Nelda Marengo, and my wife Carolyn Stuart is handling some of the tech on the other end here, so I appreciate what she's doing for us tonight. So let's start looking at Temple 18. I'm going to share my screen again, and really what we're going to be developing here and setting the stage for is one of the great puzzles in Maya archaeology, a physical puzzle, right? These are plaster or stucco hieroglyphs that essentially fell off of a wall in a temple at Palenque. And over the course of several decades, they were recovered, many of them. Most of them, in fact, were probably recovered, but we're still missing quite a bit that are destroyed. We'll talk about that later. We have a jumbled text, right? As you see in this old photo. These are beautiful hieroglyphs. These have caught the attention of many students of Maya writing over the years because of their kind of three-dimensional form, their sculpted form, the beauty of them, the artistry of them. And we've appreciated that, and we have used these in some ways to study sign distributions, substitution patterns, and things like that that epigraphers do. But it's hard to do that if the inscription is all jumbled like this. What you see in this old photograph taken in the 1940s is just some random bits of the inscription that were put up on wooden planks for photography back in the 1940s. This is not a text that you see here in this opening slide. This is just one of the many records of these glyphs that was done a long time ago. So let's talk about context and setting and Palenque itself. Now, as I briefly mentioned a second ago, if you've never heard of Temple XVIII and you've been to Palenque, that's okay. It is not one of the big touristy architectural monuments of Palenque. It's very hard to visit today. In fact, it's in a section of the site that's roped off. So you can't really go there without permission nowadays. But, until fairly recently you could. It's, I'll show you on the map exactly where it is. It's not visible in this photograph. But it really was ignored by the first explorers of Palenque because it was a fairly modest building. So this is downtown Palenque, right? Temple XVIII is actually quite close. It's just to the left of this slide and to the south of the cross group. You see on the left the Temple of the Sun, which is one of the main temples of the cross group. Looking at the dead center at the Temple of the Inscriptions, the palace on the right. These are all perhaps familiar monuments to you all who have, any of you who visited Palenque and walked around. Temple XVIII, despite its relative fame among epigraphers and people who study hieroglyphs, it's not known to many others. It's also been studied quite a bit by various archaeologists who've excavated and taken measurements around the remains of the structure, which we'll talk about. Now, even though many of you probably, I assume, haven't been to Temple XVIII itself, I think it's probably all covered in vegetation even today. You probably, if you have been to Palenque and to the museum, seen the hieroglyphs or some of the hieroglyphs. This is what you see today, a mounted display of the best preserved, kind of a random selection of well-preserved glyphs that were recovered from the temple over the years. These were set in cement many years ago for the display in the old Palenque Museum, and this array of stucco hieroglyphs is still there and still visible. So I think when you walk into the museum, you still can see this near the entrance, and they're mesmerizing, right? You look at these glyphs, they're gorgeous examples of Maya writing, calligraphic art, you might say in a broad sense. And one thing that I always find interesting about these glyphs, this is very intentional on part of the scribe. Every hieroglyphic block that you see here contains at least one animate element. In other words, there's a very conscious decision on the part of the scribe to take a sign, whether it's a sign for "u" for the third person pronoun, and to turn it into a profile head and not just use the conventional form. The same thing is true with these profile heads you see everywhere, which are numbers, right? Here's a 0 and a 0 and a 0. These are numbers, parts of distance number calculations and so forth. Every block here has a face, whether it's an animal or a human. So there's this interest in animating the inscription, right? This is something that we know Maya artisans and scribes were really interested in doing, which is giving animate form to things, including, in this case, the written form, right? So I've always admired this aspect of the design of the Temple XVIII text. It's not something you see necessarily so regularly displayed in a single inscription. The other place that some of you may have seen Temple XVIII hieroglyphs is in Chipotle restaurants here in the United States. In several of these restaurants, an artist has made these large artistic displays based on, I think, photographs that I presume he found on the internet of the Temple XVIII stuccos. I've sometimes been shocked when I walk into a Chipotle in Birmingham, Massachusetts, or Burlington, Massachusetts, and see, you know, a stucco hieroglyph on the wall. It's kind of jarring and kind of weird. But there you have it. These are all over the place these days. I think Mark Zender, who's here with us, has even commented on this to people who've inquired about it. So kind of an amusing sideshow here about Temple XVIII. Let's step back though. Let's look also at the wider kind of tradition of stucco art at Palenque, just briefly. We all know and admire the stucco work at Palenque. It's very famous for this. On the palaces you see here, one of the piers of House D. Many of the exterior walls and surfaces of the temples and palace at Palenque have these stucco reliefs, including hieroglyphs. So you see here, this is Maudsley's old photo of one of the piers from House D. The stucco hieroglyphs adhering to the wall. Kind of a miracle that these are even preserved here. I think they're still up there. Other stucco glyphs in a horizontal line above these scenes, and the figures you see here. One of the things to mention about Palenque and its kind of history as a ruin and as a visited ruin is that especially in the 19th century, in the 1830s and 40s, people came here and would just rip the faces off the walls, you know, of some of these sculptures. So it's very common to see bodies without heads, you know, they're souvenirs. I think Antonio del Rio in the late 18th century took this particular head, which is preserved, but you know, others are missing. You know, it's incredible that these were ever preserved in any way, given the setting and the environment of Palenque. But we have a lot of stuccos, right? Another good example of stucco glyphs, not unlike the ones from Temple XVIII, are these also from the palace. This particular photo, also by Maudsley, shows the remains of an inscription on a pier from House A, which is on the other side of the palace, right? This is on the eastern side. And you see that most of them have fallen off, right? And you see the vague outlines here of the glyphs that have fallen, some still adhering to the wall. You know, you can almost see how they're applied to the wall by the ancient artists. It's very likely that these, in fact, I don't think there's much doubt that in many cases these were pre-made, almost like cookies on a cookie sheet. And then they would have been applied directly to the wall vertically and then kind of embedded in with plaster. So there's still some interesting questions I have about kind of the process of making stucco hieroglyphs and you know, putting them up and designing them. There's a great example of technique here that I wanted to share with you before we get to Temple XVIII. Again, this is from the palace. This is from that horizontal band I was just showing you a couple of slides ago. Another section of this horizontal text that went above House D of the palace. These individual glyphs that are set into cartouches. it's an inscription that probably was a dedicatory text for the actual building, giving us a date, and in this case, part of the lunar calendar for that date. Now, I've always thought this is hilarious because there's a problem here, right? This particular section has a mistake, an ancient Maya mistake, in that the hieroglyph, the first one that you see, even though it has a face that's looking off to the left, as many Maya hieroglyphs do, in this particular case, it's not supposed to be oriented that way. It's supposed to be oriented this way. And what this tells us is that an ancient scribe made a proper hieroglyph. This says Huli, decipherment by Barb McLeod. It arrived, Huliya, 3 syllables. Very well done, right? In fact, there's another example of it right here in this inscription, right? That's correctly oriented. But in this inscription, they botched it. Whoever was putting the glyphs physically on the wall put it the wrong way. And I just find this a wonderful example of an ancient Maya mistake, physical mistake, not a spelling mistake. But perhaps it means that the person who was up there physically putting the glyphs as objects, right, in the wall, may not have been literate, or may not have been quite so careful, at least, right? So this is just a really interesting example of that. So let's get to Temple 18. We're going to talk about its setting, its design as an architectural structure, and the history of its investigation, right? Finally, we can talk about Temple 18 itself. Here is Maudsley's old map of Palenque, still quite a good one, I think, of downtown Palenque. The orientation here might be a little confusing because north is to the left, the way he published it. Here's the palace. Here's the Temple of the Inscriptions. Here's the cross group, okay? Now, to the south of the cross group, you see this platform with 2 buildings on it. Maudsley mapped Temple 18, and its companion, known as Temple 18A. He says nothing about it in anything I can find, but he clearly was up there taking measurements and surveying in order to make this map. He also cleared much of the forest in this entire area in order to make these measurements and sightlines. Temple 19 is over here to the far corner near the spring of the Otulum River. So there it is. There's Temple 18. It's the northernmost of this pair. Maudsley doesn't indicate much about it because it's a collapsed structure, right? It doesn't have a vault. You can't walk into it the way you can walk into the Temple of the Sun, or even partially into the Temple of the Foliated Cross. It's a ruined building, but apparently with exterior walls that he could measure. Another view taken several years later, not taken, but drawn by William Henry Holmes, the wonderful artist and archaeologist from the Smithsonian and the Field Museum. He did this aerial view of Palenque after Maudsley had cleared the site. The vegetation kind of grew up, and it must have been brambles and really hard to walk around. But here you see the cross group. We're looking south here. And just in the sketch, you see kind of the vague remains of a building there. That's Temple 18. So again, Holmes may have walked around. He may have taken measurements, but nobody noticed anything special about it back in those days. In a much more modern survey, Ed Barnhart's map of Palenque shows a little more clearly the location of 18 and Temple 18A, this double pyramid or double temple. Here's 19, and here's the cross group to the north. Okay, so this is a more conventional orientation. I wanted to point out here that 18 is part of this larger cross group assemblage, right? We often think of the cross group as these three buildings, these three great temples, the cross, the sun, the foliated cross. Rightly so, right? There's a triadic grouping with the three gods housed there. But over the course of the decades and subsequent generations and rulers, they essentially expanded the cross group. And they did that by expanding its plaza southward along this line that kind of bends slightly towards the spring of the Otulum River, or Rio Otulum, which is right about here. That axis, I think, is really accentuated and kind of, you know, made rather rigid by the orientation of Temple 19. And also these platforms you see here. These are plazas that step upward towards Temple 19 from the cross group as you move south. Temple 18 is kind of part of that, right? It's part of this southernmost plaza, also with Temple 20 here facing it on the other side. So almost like another triadic group to the south that complements a triadic group to the north. It's not so neatly packaged as the cross group, but you know, there's a mirroring, I think, going on here in terms of architectural form. This is a hypothetical reconstruction view that was made back in the 90s of this kind of curving, bending axiality between the Temple of the Cross and Temple 19, which is where the viewer is standing here. So Temple 18 is up here in its, you know, just imagined as a Palenque temple up here as part of this pair. So this gives you an idea of kind of probably what it looked like more or less. Something here that's kind of speculative, but I wanted to mention it, is this connection between the Temple of the Cross and the spring. This line that I think is very meaningful in the orientation of the cross group, may be reflecting some cosmological spatial concepts that we see written about in the inscriptions. We know the Temple of the Cross is essentially a celestial temple. Its shrine is covered in sky imagery, for example. And it's pointing directly to the spring. And I've wondered if this may actually be a play or a representation spatially of this pairing of words, chan meaning sky and chen meaning cave, or in some context, spring or cliff, or kind of an outcropping of rock. The term Chan-Chen will be familiar to some of you who study hieroglyphs because it's all over the cross group. It's mentioned throughout the shrines of the cross group itself. And so I see a connection there just between the space of the cross group and some of this terminology. Why are they talking about sky caves? Well, rather than being talking about a cave that's up in the heavens, that's not really the sense here. It's a pairing, right? This is one of these examples of a difrasismo in Mesoamerican languages, you know, the sky and the cave. It's what's up above us and what's down below us, right? And I think it's this idea of vertical axiality that's important in how Mesoamerican architects were designing space. I think they describe these ceremonial plazas, essentially, these nodes of activity. Another part of the package here that we have to talk about in terms of landscape is the pinnacle, the hill that's associated with the cross group. It's actually part of the cross group, I would argue, as the backdrop of the Temple of the Foliated Cross. This is the hill known as Mirador today. And Temple 18 is down over here just off the slide to the right. Okay, this is an image taken from the Temple of the Inscriptions looking directly towards the cross group. A lot of intentional orientation and axiality going on here in another direction. Now, I wanted to mention this because I think we know the name of this hill. This is cited in several texts at Palenque, mostly in the cross group and in Temple 18 itself. Yehmal Uk Lakamwitz, below or at the base of the Quetzal Banner Hill, right? These are all identical spellings of that sequence of words, using syllables, using word signs. Ye malak uk witzi, ye malak uk lakam witz, ye malak uk. Well, we're missing some here from Temple 18, and then this really nice one here, right? You can maybe see the Quetzal bird in all of the examples, right? So I think that's the name of the Mirador Hill. Kind of a circumstantial argument, but that's the ceremonial hill of central Palenque, right? Quetzal Banner Hill. There's a building on top of it that's never been investigated, which I think will turn out to be pretty important in the ceremonial architectural design of Palenque in general. So this is part of Temple 18. Temple 18 is built right on the foot of that Quetzal Banner Hill. Let's get to the archaeology. Really, Maudsley didn't really pay attention to Temple 18. Holmes didn't pay attention to Temple 18. Certainly earlier people didn't either. The first person to really take note of it was Franz Blom. And he visited Palenque right after this photo was taken. He was in Palenque in 1925. Here he is working at Washington in 1924. And Blom, as many of you know, was affiliated with Tulane University. And in 1925, there was a Tulane expedition that went through much of the isthmus area of Tehuantepec into Palenque and Chiapas. This was published in a famous book with Oliver Lafarge called Tribes and Temples. And it was in that publication that Blom recounts his notice of Temple 18 and of some of the hieroglyphs still adhering to the wall. This is taken right out of Tribes and Temples. And he mentions here, while measuring these buildings, a hieroglyphic inscription was discovered on the back wall. Amazing that Maudsley never saw it. Maybe something fell and exposed them. It says the upper part of this inscription, modeled in stucco, had been protected by some large stones from the roof. So here he is. He mentions that he took some of them off, or many of them off, in order to preserve them. Thank goodness, because they probably would have been lost otherwise. And he put them in a small museum, quote, which I erected near the palace. I'm curious what that was. Maybe the first museum of Palenque, I guess, was a makeshift one. But these glyphs did preserve. And most importantly, what Blom did was a sketch of what he saw. This is again taken straight from that publication. And, these are pretty, they're not great drawings, I have to say. For epigraphic analysis, we wish we had maybe some better sketches here, but they're recognizable. And thank goodness, because it was this record that allowed the physical glyphs, right, once they were preserved in the storage rooms at Palenque, to actually be kind of reconstructed in the form that Blom saw them, right? So this is a really valuable record. I do want to mention something curious about Blom's drawing. Many of you won't realize this looking at the sketch, but a few of you epigraphers here, Barb, Mark, others who might be here, notice that some of these glyphs are inverted or oriented very strangely. This one here actually is upside down from what it should be. And this one here is oriented incorrectly too, facing up when it should be facing this way. I wonder, did Blom mess up the drawing? Or is he actually showing us glyphs that were incorrectly placed, just like we saw in the palace. It's possible. I'll come back to that maybe when we have a better image to look at. Okay. This is not from Blom. This is taken much later in the 1940s, I think. I can't quite remember which source this was. I think it's the report, no, from the 50s by Cesar Science, showing that wall. This is a mess. You don't see anything at all, right? It's just a very badly constructed wall. You can see here the masonry, as Blum said, is just terrible. Little bit of stucco still preserved, but check this out. If you look closely, you'll see the outlines of the hieroglyphs, right? Really hard to see, but there's a line of them right here. And this is what Blum is recording. Also, you'll see some glyphs right here that have fallen off. And also, and take my word for it, these are glyphs that are still on the wall, right here. In fact, this is another glyph that's still adhering to the wall. Now, I squinted for a long time at this, trying to figure it out. I looked at Blum's drawing and realized, well, we could probably match these up. These are drawings, more modern drawings of these glyphs by Linda Sheely. And these correspond to the ones that Blum sketched right here. This rodent glyph, the chok term meaning youth, is what we see right here, right? So there it is. So it's kind of interesting to actually see a photo with some of the glyphs still just barely sticking to the wall. Really valuable record here. It also shows us some of the architectural stones right here that is where the vault spring is, where the corbel vault begins above the vertically placed wall in the back of the temple. Now, after Blum, nobody did anything, right? Until the 1940s. It was almost 2 decades. And in 1942, it really was the first, I think, archaeological project that Heinrich Berlin, the famous Mayanist, participated in. He was assisting Miguel Angel Fernandez, the INA archaeologist at Palenque. And this was one of the first projects run by the Mexican National Institute of Anthropology. Certainly the first project after INA was founded in the Maya area. And it was a conservation project, essentially. And Berlin excavated a number of hieroglyphs from that fallen debris right in front of Temple 18. And that's where you see, I think, some of these historical photographs, right? Berlin was very meticulous. I think he really developed his interest in Maya epigraphy through this kind of work, right? And he published some of these through drawings in various places, right? The publication history is a little complicated of these things. But one thing that he did do is he took the arrangement that Blum saw, and with much better drawings of the glyphs, kind of placed them and arranged them in a way that made them much more legible and much more understandable. Here, by the way, is that upside down hieroglyph I was just telling you about. I suspect that it actually was placed on the wall upside down by an ancient Maya worker. But who knows? It's hard to say. We're going to come back to this and kind of show how this is a key clue, needless to say, about any kind of future work in understanding the larger context and arrangement. So this is published by Alberto Ruz in 1954, and really kind of anchors anything we can say about the inscription in terms of it being a physical text. Now, one thing I didn't mention before that Blom recorded, it's really essential, is that we have large hieroglyphs and we have small hieroglyphs, right? The small hieroglyphs are part, as Blom himself recognized, are part of a scene with figures. They're essentially small sequences that are names or captions that go with a figural scene. What you're looking at right here is part of a headdress of a figure who was facing towards the right. Blohm said he thought this was a standing figure, but I actually think there's no space for him to be standing. I think he's probably sitting, as we'll talk about. Another really essential clue that I'm going to go back to Blohm's drawing here and show you. Look at the sketch right here. When Blohm saw it, there was a seated figure in the center of this design. The legs, crossed legs. By the time that it's drawn by Hipólito Sanchez, all that's left is a little bit of a thrown pillow, like we see in other Palenque designs. So the seated central figure would have been right here. There's a lot more to say about this, right? Because we can identify some of the names. We can identify who was depicted, even though we're missing the actual portraits. And also we have a date. That's also quite important. A calendar round date preserved with its elements, all right there, again, in kind of the center of the design. We'll come back to that too. Some other historical photographs, really interesting, from the 50s. After Berlin, the next kind of round of investigations was done by Cesar Sáenz, the famous archaeologist who in these years was working alongside Alberto Ruz, right? Remember in 1954, this is when Palenque is going gangbusters, right? This is when Pacal's tomb is being just brand newly discovered, right, in 1952. So a couple of years earlier. A lot of resources going into Palenque, a lot of people visiting and checking it out. And this is when Temple XVIII is again investigated. What you're looking at here is another one of these important photos. You're looking north. Okay, so it's a little confusing perhaps. This is the back wall here that had the glyphs and the stucco figures. This is a interior wall with a doorway that opened right into the sanctuary where you would have seen the stuccos. So you're looking kind of a side view here. There were these kind of rustic secondary walls and benches that were built into the structure after the stucco, which is something we often see in Palenque architecture, in the palace or in the cross group. The Maya love to add walls to things and modify some of these spaces. So clearly Temple XVIII was used for a long time. It was modified somewhat in its heyday. Notice here the kind of how this wall is sloped forward, right? Just the weight of that vault clearly sent everything forward, right, when it collapsed. And this is probably how some of the hieroglyphs popped off the wall in antiquity or whenever that happened. So I love these old photographs. They're really important documents. I also like this photo of one of the stucco glyphs just poking out of the dirt. Can you imagine being one of these archaeologists and just physically finding glyphs in the matrix of the soil, right? Just almost like cookies coming out of the dirt, right? And there they are. It would have been thrilling for Berlin and for Ruz and others. So here's the plan of the building, right? Similar to a lot of Palenque structures, you have 3 doorways in the front. These are all collapsed. You have an inner doorway that's centrally placed, and then you have a back wall, and this is where the glyphs were and the stuccos. Okay. This blob you see here in the map, it says here, this is where the glyphs, the stucco glyphs were found on the floor, right? So they're all just kind of fallen right here, right below where Blohm saw those, last ones just adhering very, very tenderly to the wall, right? They were right below there. This doorway, as I will explain in a minute, I think is really important in terms of the spatial geometry of the building and of the stuccos on the back wall. In other words, this axis here, this AB line in the plan, actually is significant for looking at the way the glyphs are distributed on the back wall, I believe. The other thing that's important here, you see these black lines on either side of the door, these thick black lines. Those are hieroglyphic panels, stone panels, not stucco, but stone panels. And the texts on them are also very important for understanding everything else. Here's a map that was published by Alberto Ruz showing the various stages of discovery of the glyphs that fell off the wall. You notice they're all carefully numbered, right? So these are important, I think, in the eventual reconstructions that might come out in the future of where these glyphs were originally placed, because, you know, fairly obviously, some of these glyphs like 47 or 51 are probably not from over here, right? They're probably going to be from the more right-hand side of the inscription. Here are the stone panels. These are photos I had not seen until recently that are in the Fototeca of INA. They're very low res versions of the photos, but you see them in situ, right? These are panels that were largely found in situ, but this one over here, that's the back wall, by the way, right? You're looking at the door jamb. That's the left door jamb, and this is the right door jamb with debris. This particular panel here had been found by Maudsley way over on the hillside near the cross groups. It had been removed in antiquity, but with the excavation, they realized it was part of this jamb. So these are these long, beautiful limestone tablets that flanked the central doorway. They're called jambas or jambs. That always made me think they were placed kind of perpendicular to the stuccos, right? To me, I think of a door jamb as kind of the narrow edges of a door, but actually they were lateral panels that were on either side of the door. And I made this arrangement the other day to kind of illustrate that. This is the inner door of the temple, and this is how those two tablets would have been oriented or placed, right? So really interesting to kind of finally see how they would have been architecturally shown, you know. We have in this inscription a name of a significant historical figure. I'm showing you the old drawing here because this comes from Ruz's time. It wasn't recognized at the time, however, as a name, and it's these two hieroglyphs right here from the right-hand tablet. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about who this is. This is the royal name that we associate with Temple XVIII, and it's the name of the king whose reign it corresponds to. We call him Kinich Akul Motnab. He was born in the year 678, and he ruled for about 20 years in the time after Pakal was reigning. In fact, he was Pakal's grandson. We know that from the parentage statements that we have, many of which are, you know, found throughout Palenque's texts. And there was probably one, in fact, in Temple XVIII. What you're looking at here are two more examples of his name, both ornate in their own way and very different from each other. You might be wondering, how in the world are these the same thing? Well, it's because, of course, Maya scribes often like to write things differently. But we understand now how they are putting these together, how these put these elements together to spell the name. On a historical note or historiographical note, we weren't quite sure who this was. You know, back in the 70s, he was recognized as a important ruler, but it was hard to identify a portrait of him. With time, though, we realized that the central figure of the famous Tablet of the Slaves is a portrait of Kinich Akul Monab. In fact, his name is right here in another form. And so here he is, right, with his mother over here and his father over here. This is the ruler who was responsible for Temple 18. He first really came to people's attention through the tablet of the 96 glyphs. And the reason is it was this text, this beautiful, famous text of Palenque, that allowed Heinrich Berlin to first identify late classic rulers of Palenque. Berlin, George Kubler in the 1960s, were really the first ones to identify the names of historical individuals, of kings, in the wake of Perskyriakoff's great breakthrough. And so it was Berlin who, in 1968, published an analysis of the 96 glyphs, and he calls it Subject C, right? This is not a very romantic name or designation, but this is the same guy. Peter Matthews, Linda Sheely, in their breakthrough article where they pulled together a lot of this information, called him Lord Chak. A little bit later, Linda and Peter call him Makina Chakal, or just Chakal, and he's known in the literature a lot as just Chakal the Third, right? They're more earlier kings. But, you know, by the 1980s, really, I think it was the mid-1980s, we kind of nailed down the components of his name, even earlier than 1990. Kinich Akul Monab. That's a name that we've now known, gosh, for at least 30 years. And you know, we've tweaked it here and there, but we can read it pretty well. So I'm going to be calling him Kinich Akul Monab. For short, maybe sometimes in slides KAMN, but he's the guy. He's the grandson of Pakal, who is responsible for this and other buildings. As I mentioned, there are other kings with this name. Okay, not to be confused. There are two other early classic rulers who have this designation. So Kinich Akul Monab is the late classic kind of third iteration of this name. We can call him Akul Monab, you know, the first, Akul Monab the second, and the late classic ruler we're talking about would be the third, right? So this is just more examples of that same name, in you know, mentioned on the sarcophagus of Pakal as well, two of Pakal's ancestors. Now, in terms of the history of research, so much of Temple 18 came together, you know, all of these spread out publications, all of this disparate material really came together with the landmark publication by Linda Sheely and Peter Matthews of the Bodega Catalog, right? 1979, published by Dumbarton Oaks. And here you see the drawings, the photographs that are really, you know, beautiful documentations of these glyphs, much better than anything that had been done before, with some commentary here and there, right? Some interpretations of the calendrical elements and even of some of the names. So this is the source, right? This is available online, by the way, through the Dumbarton Oaks website, doaks.org. You can track down the online version of this publication and see the photos and the drawings. Pretty much everything is there, but there are, I think, a couple of hieroglyphic blocks that went astray after they were excavated in the 40s and 50s that didn't end up in the catalog that Linda and Peter published. The best analysis of the Temple 18 inscription that's ever been published to date is that by Bill Ringel. And he published this in 1996 in one of the Mesas Redondas of Palenque. It's the go-to source for anyone who wants to study this. It's kind of required reading for our workshop, because Bill, shown here photographing a monument up in Yucatan not that long ago at Huntichmul. He took the raw materials from Blom, from Berlin, from Sheely Matthews, and he really distilled a lot of it. He worked out a lot of the dates, and he identified more of the historical content. And this is just one of the illustrations of how Ringel put together sequences of glyphs that I think are quite reasonable. And he used other Palenque inscriptions and cross-referenced them in such a way that really makes sense, right? So, for example, he identified Akal Monab, here called Chakal, right? His name glyph and the date of his accession, right, is pretty well established here. And so you could kind of string these together or associate these together. So that was really important. This was the beginning of getting a sense of what's going on. But probably the most important thing that Bill did was realize that there's a name, historical name, that gets repeated throughout this fallen text. He calls him Lord T231, right? Because again, at that point, we weren't quite sure what to call him. And as Bill said, and I agree, I think this is the protagonist of the inscription in many ways. We've been calling this guy Tiwol Chanmat. I'm not so sure about the beginning of this name. That's why I put a question mark there. But it's this odd-looking face, this long-lipped guy, droopy lips, right? That might be read Tiwol, we're not exactly sure, but much better and much more transparent is the number 4, or a sky sign as Chan Mata, right? So we can at least pronounce that pretty well. And here he is. This is the father of Akal Monab. He's shown here on the tablet of the slaves. That's him. So Ringel identified him, I think, correctly as the father of Akal Monab, or Kinich Akal Monab. And here also the mother's name appears in the Temple 18 glyphs. So that's really interesting. We have this, partial genealogy that's represented in Temple 18 pretty clearly now. Another thing that Bill did that I thought was really important is he linked the inscription of the stucco glyphs with a kind of, modest little text on a stone incense burner stand that was recovered in the Temple of the Cross. And he realized that many of the dates are the same. And he realized that the protagonist of this inscription is the same guy, right? There he is. And this is one of the things that allowed him to really cross-reference the inscription and, begin a structural analysis, right? He realized that the contents overlap considerably. And this is also going to be really important. Here we have the birth date of Tiwol Chanmat. We have the death date of Tiwol Chanmat. We have the burial date of Tiwol Chanmat. There's a lot going on here, right? So it's kind of a biographical text that echoes some of what we appear to have in the Temple 18 inscription. I did a new drawing of this based on photographs, and also showing a fit that has never really been illustrated before. This flange here on the left that's in the National Museum in Mexico City is the opening section, the opening date of this particular text with the birth of Tiwol Chanmat. So here's the family, right? I just wanted to illustrate this. Our protagonist is this guy. And again, this is something that Bill pretty much worked out, the relationships here. He is, I think, without much doubt, the third son of Pakal. That is the younger brother of Kanbalam and Kanhoichitam. And his relationship to the king who dedicated the temple itself is shown here, right? So he is the father of Kinichakulmanab. He is the linchpin, in other words, right, between the great dynastic figure of Pakal and the two sons there who ruled. But what we know from the history is that Tiwol Chanmat died rather young. He was only about 32 when he died, never took the throne, and nevertheless seems to be the link that's really necessary in this family history, right? The scene, the stucco scene, has those three brothers. This is quite interesting. We have speech texts. We have the name of Kanbalam, the name of Kanshul, or I'm sorry, I'm using the old names here, of Kanhoichitam, and then the name here of Tiwol Chanmat. These are just name captions, so they're almost surely those three brothers, right? I argued in a kind of a very tentative way that given the date here and given the fact that they're talking about, succession and sequencing, that this might be the time when Pakal, shortly before his death, is laying out the succession of his sons, right, to be the next kings. And that's why it's on Temple 18, right? Because it's really showing how the father was one of the three brothers, right? Really accentuating that relationship. About the scene too, the way I'm kind of beginning to understand it is it may have been arranged kind of like what we see here in another Palenque tablet. Notice we just have glyph captions. We have a little bit of a figure here. We have an central enthroned figure, probably Pakal, I suspect. And in the Temple 19 platform, we have kind of a similar looking arrangement, right? So I'm willing to bet that we would have seen something like that up here, a central seated figure with lateral seated attendants. So last part, and I'll wrap up soon. There is some interesting symmetry in the temple and in the arrangement of the text that I'd like to talk about, because it seems like a hopeless case, right? It seems like how in the world will these things ever be put back together? I don't think we'll ever put it all together, but I do think we can put a lot of it in a sequence, building on the work that Ringel did and building on the observations that Blom made in his essential document. So I think there's hope here for some progress. And again, it hinges on this center line. It hinges on the placement of the stucco glyphs relative to the door and the two stone panels. Remember, this is what it looked like, right? As you walk in the inner temple, or would have walked in, you would have seen something like this. Okay. This is just a summary of some of the events that and themes that are in these tablets. Kinichakulmanab, that's what KAMN stands for. He's born. His father is Tiwol Chanmat. There's a youth ceremony and a period ending. Okay. And then we have the accession of the king and a back reference to deep mythology, going back 7 Baktuns. It's all pretty arcane stuff, but the point here is that Kinichakulmanab is being crowned as a like-in-kind event to a deity who was the one who engendered the Palenque triad, both on the same day, 9 Wind, and then it happens below the Quetzalbanner Hill. So it's nice to see how the space and the text relate to each other. There's symmetry, right? Youth and maturity, right? The accession is kind of the pivot point of this narrative. But there's more to it, I think. One thing that I just realized not long ago, looking at this, which I think is really fabulous, is that the citation of the father's name and the citation of the mother's name, who is here a goddess who is accompanying the engenderer of the triad back in mythical time, they're placed exactly opposite one another. And this is a textual representation of that same symmetry that you see here, right? Father on the left, mother on the right, and son in the middle, right? So this is all intentional. There's no question about it. There's all this, I call this mirroring, because the Maya are always mirroring things in their design elements. And that's going to be really important, I think, for looking at the text itself. So let me just go ahead here. I'm going to show you this bilateral symmetry is really important for all sorts of texts at Palenque, right? We've seen this. Look at the cross group. I mean, a lot of those tablets are completely designed as bilateral symmetrical formats. Temple 19 bench is one as well. Okay. The 96 glyphs, in fact, even though it's purely hieroglyphs, there's symmetry, right? Because you take a center line, everything to the left of the center line is about past rulers. Everything to the right of the center line is about the contemporary ruler who's dedicating this. Anyway, that's for another topic, but it is a key part of looking at Maya reliefs and artworks and texts themselves. If we do that for the stucco text, the center line of the doorway falls right in between these columns of glyphs that Blom saw on the wall. And I think what this allows us to do is start to envision the larger format of the text. So what I've done here, and Bill Ringel did a little bit of this before, but I'm really looking at this idea of the center line as a way of envisioning how the whole thing was put together. There could not have been glyphs up above because that's the sloping corbelled vault. Just kind of sketching it out, I don't think it would have gone too far down below this line, but it could have, right? And the figures I just kind of sketched in here, these ghostly figures, I really do think that must be how they were presented, not as standing figures, but as seated figures. There's just enough to tell us that. We have here something about 192 glyphs. There could have been some more if it extended down below, but I don't think so. What I did just yesterday was I took this sketch. I'm not doing much in the way of digital representation here. I'm literally just sketching this on a piece of blank paper, right? Taking that center line, and I put it on the wall, right, through the doorway. And it fits really well. It fits really nicely. So I think it's really important to see, for example, how double column of glyphs on the outside. I think this double row up here is kind of integrating that, right, in terms of design above the figures. It's not one text, but visually, I think it helps hold it together. Who knows about down here, right? This is our puzzle. The puzzle is all down here, but there are elements up here that allow us to maybe place a few glyphs in these columns below the seated scene. Okay. So that's the format that I'm kind of excited by that, right? I'm kind of excited that we can visualize or begin to visualize what this thing may have looked like originally. So this is it. This is my last point. We're looking at a detailed biographical account of the father of Kiwal Chanmat. And this is a little over 50 years after he dies, when the temple is dedicated. Maybe around the year 731. Hard to nail that down, but it had to have been around that time. I wonder if maybe a 52-year anniversary of the father's death may have motivated some of this, but that's just supposition. And, you know, from what we can glean here, we're looking at a political statement. You know, it's Akal Monab who is talking about his father, but he's really talking about, you know, a deeper past, and on the exterior of the door, at least, he's talking about mythology. And so these are all familiar themes, right? This is exactly what his uncle was doing in the cross group temples. And I think Kinichak Kalmonab is doing this in his own kind of more modest way through his father. With Temple 18. I think that's largely the point. The other kind of large thing to emphasize here is we need more documentation and more reconstruction. Okay, that just goes without saying. Okay, so I think that's my last slide. We have a lot to do. There is progress to be made here. Not all of it, but we're, I think, able to put some of this in a lot more context than we imagined before, and so I'm excited. So here's the plan, folks. Starting in January, I believe the 16th, we have plans for a interactive workshop where in helping out Boundary End, I hope you can sign up and we can work on this together, right? We're going to be meeting on Tuesdays starting in January. There's a schedule that's up on the website. And yeah, if enough people sign up, we can begin to look at this together. It's not stuff that I've prepared, you know, in advance to present to you. You know, it's much more of a workshop environment. And I think it would be great to do that, right? It's a great opportunity. I've gone long here. It's 10 minutes after 7, but I might just have time for, say, 2 questions. I don't want to just stop things here. I want to encourage this idea of a workshop by maybe seeing if any of you have questions. I can take 2. So what I'm going to ask you to do is maybe raise your hand in the Zoom way that I can see. And I will just kind of randomly pick the ones that I can see here on my screen. And I'm happy to answer a question or 2. And I really appreciate, again, you all being here, my colleagues being here, interested folks. I know many of you are here from a long way away, and I've gone long here, so I apologize for that. So if I do see a hand somewhere, let me see. I don't see one, but if you want to unmute, you can also ask that way. Oh, Andy Esters, I see your hand. So yeah, if you can unmute yourself.
Okay, there it goes. Yes, I just had a question about the workshop coming up. So I'm more of a novice when it comes
Mhm.
to epigraphy and in this field, but I do have a background in history and archaeology. Are there prerequisites for the workshop, or is it kind of a everyone's welcome, no
Yeah,
boundaries?
well, no, it's a great question. We struggle sometimes when we conceive of these workshops. Is it intro, is it intermediate, or whatever? It's really hard. It's hard to peg these things because I just remember, the old workshops here in Austin. Everyone was in it together, right? It was just one big uh, uh, event where people came from all sorts of backgrounds. I Short answer, I think if you're really interested in the details of my epigraphy, yes, absolutely. Feel welcome. Do some background reading if you want to. That I encourage that before things get going. There's some very good intro texts out there. But people are going to be coming at this from all sorts of different levels, right? So there's no great answer for that, right? But I would encourage you. I'm not going to say no, you can't come if you have no real background on this. I think it's the way I learned it, right? It's the way a lot of us learned it, was just diving in, right? There's really no other way. That's the way I would put it. There's a question from Huang Taiyang. Could you briefly explain some ties between glyphs and the tomb of Temple 18? I saw that there were 3 tombs in the drawing of the temple plan. Great question. I didn't get to that. So those tombs were found in the front hall or gallery of Temple 18. My understanding from the reports is that the skeletal remains were basically non-existent. The preservation was terrible. There were jades and ceramics. Those have been published. The report that really goes into the most detail is the Nales report under the name of Ruz, published in the 1954, I believe, or 56. And also this Cesar Science report, I have the hard copy right here, goes into some of that with some of the plans and artifacts. Now, one question that we can maybe address in some ways is who's in these tombs? It's hard to say. They're not labeled with hieroglyphs. But the possibility is that there's a glyph in the Temple 18 text that says his tomb, right? And it does say that, Umuknal. And considering that Tiwol Chanmat is the protagonist, maybe he is in that central tomb. There's just no way to confirm that, right? So I'm glad you asked that question because yeah, they're there in the floors. It's a funerary structure. We just don't know yet how they're talking about it in the inscription. Patrick Rohrer, you have your hand raised. So, Patrick.
Hi. Thanks for a very interesting talk. In reference to the glyphs that are in the improper positions to the left or upside down and that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I kind of had 2 different ideas about that. One, what is the sense or possibility that you get about the idea that perhaps some of these may have fallen off in antiquity or later on in colonial period or what have you, and then were replaced and restuck on, and then those people didn't know the right order.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that. I guess that's possible. We'll never know if Temple 18, if those glyphs that Blom sketched upside down actually were upside down. I can't figure out how he would have sketched them upside down in the first place, right, if they weren't. But that one that's in the Palace of Palenque that I showed early on, that's way up high. I guess, if someone really wanted to try to restore it and it came off, that would have had to have happened, I think, in in antiquity. It would have had to have happened, in the classic period. So it's kind of the same thing. Someone who's not literate, who is dealing with this object and not quite knowing how to orient it up on the wall.
Yeah, the other thing is, I doubt that this would make much sense, but I'm familiar in a lot of cases, maybe in a couple of glyphs here and there, or singular glyphs being mirrored. Is there any chance that something could be upside down on purpose to kind of be read in a way? I know these are kind of glyphs placed in where all the rest of them are supposed to be in the right order, so that might not make sense in this case. But is there any other examples anywhere of things other than it being mirrored, like in some cases, but of a glyph being purposefully, oriented sideways or upside down?
Yeah, great question. Yes, in the sense that we have a surprising number of rearranged inscriptions. This is a whole other topic. I have a student actually who's studying it right now, in kind of in an art historical way. But I'm thinking here of hieroglyphic stairways, where the blocks have been removed and reset out of order, which is really labor intensive. That takes a lot of effort. The stairways from Resbolon and Quintana Roo are an example. The Great Naranjo stairway that's from Caracol that gets rebuilt out of order is another example. The La Corona stairway that we discovered about a decade ago, also out of order. So yeah, it makes me wonder if maybe some of the turned glyphs on the Temple 18 wall, maybe they're there as some sort of after the fact cancellation, or what's going into the motivation of this is a really complicated issue that I'm not sure I have a good answer for, but I'm glad you raised those. Yeah, I think time is up, I'm afraid. It's great seeing some of you there. I see some of you there in the array of the Zoom. So it's good to see you guys. Thanks for coming. I hope this was interesting. I learned a lot putting it together. If you want more details about the Boundary End workshop, the info has been posted on Facebook in various places, and it's on the Boundary End website. And I encourage you to go there. So I hope we can talk more about this stuff. Okay, I appreciate it, guys. Thank you.